Treaty 4, a lesson by Swift Current Museum. This photograph shows a First Nations group south of Swift Current around 1883. Fraser Timms, proprietor of Swift Current's first store, is visiting them. He is the man on the left, wearing a bowler hat. We live in Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux bands of the Ojibwe people, Assiniboine, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. To understand what that means, we need to establish a historical context. Prehistoric populations on the Canadian plains were large, sophisticated, organized communities. Studies of skeletons have shown that in the mid-19th century, peoples on the plains were perhaps the tallest and best nourished population in the world. First Nations had a sustainable relationship with bison for thousands of years before contact with Europeans. In 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company was formed. Their main purpose was to collect beaver pelts, which were used to make felted hats like top hats. By mutually beneficial agreement, Indigenous peoples would trap beavers and other fur-bearing animals during fall and winter. They were often advanced money for supplies. In summer, they would bring the furs to trading posts and barter for metal tools, guns and ammunition, textiles, and food. Some acted as middlemen, bringing furs from farther inland. This photo shows the famous chief Big Bear trading furs for various goods. The earliest trading was with northern First Nations who were nearer to the Hudson's Bay posts situated around Hudson's Bay. In order to standardize trade among posts, the Hudson's Bay Company introduced the made beaver as the currency of the fur trade. All furs and manufactured items were valued according to this standard, which was the equivalent of one prime male beaver skin. Some cultures, like the Blackfoot Alliance, initially refused to trap beavers. Beavers were protected because their dams helped with water management during years of drought, and they also attracted wildlife. This is a great example of the wisdom and ingenuity of Indigenous people that was ignored by colonizers. The fur traders depended on First Nations not only for furs, but for food, education about the land and its resources, and community. This dependence led to the introduction of many diseases for which Indigenous people had no immunity. Smallpox was introduced in 1730 with disastrous consequences. An infected person showed no symptoms for 2 weeks, so the incurable disease spread like wildfire. There were outbreaks in the 1780s where smallpox killed 1/2 to 2/3 of some bands, leading to the starvation of survivors when there were not enough men able to hunt. 1890 brought a measles epidemic where Blackfoot lost almost 1/3 of their population. 1827 brought whooping cough. Smallpox was severe enough in 1837 that the fur transportation system collapsed. Many Assiniboine and Blackfoot deaths were the result of not being vaccinated. The Hudson Bay Company provided medical care where possible. Vaccinations, when available, were provided by Dr. William Todd, who had himself survived smallpox. He taught Hudson's Bay Company's servants and some Aboriginals how to perform the vaccinations so that more people could be reached. Prevention through the use of cowpox vaccine was relatively simple. There was not a comprehensive vaccination program by the Hudson's Bay Company until after the smallpox outbreak of 1837. When carts began to be used for Hudson's Bay Company transportation in the 1840s, flu, measles, and dysentery were spread. Governor Simpson of the HBC, no stranger to past epidemics, claimed that sickness that year led to a greater mortality than at any former period within my recollection. 1846 brought influenza, measles, and dysentery. An 1856 epidemics of smallpox nearly wiped out the Qu'Appelle Cree. This was followed by scarlet fever in 1858, likely introduced by the Hind expedition. As other groups entered the lucrative fur trade, the demand for furs increased, and Indigenous groups fought among one another for contracts. In 1773, Canadians built posts inland and began to intercept furs destined for HBC posts on Hudson's Bay. Ultimately, there were too many posts. The Canadians managed to attract many groups because they offered alcohol in trade. Hudson's Bay Company had avoided alcohol as a trading item, but by the late 1700s they built a distillery at York Factory in order to compete. In 1779, the Northwest Company was formed and the competition amped up. During this period, the Assiniboine lost interest in the fur trade and moved to being provisioners of pemmican for the growing number of traders. Plains Cree also became provisioners, feeding traders, canoe brigades, and settlers at Red River in exchange for metal pots, guns and ammunition, beads, and other luxuries. Fur trade transportation networks grew, increasing the demand for bison meat from herds that were increasingly further south. Bison herds originally numbered in the millions. A herd crossing railroad tracks could stop a train for days. As more traders and some settlers arrived, the demand for bison meat and pemmican increased. American traders began to trade for bison robes. By 1865, 200,000 hides were being delivered annually to St. Louis. The hides were used to make belts for factory machinery, gun belts, and luxury furniture. The bison population diminished rapidly. In addition to this, the Army in the United States determined that the easiest way to keep Indigenous people on their reserve land was to kill the bison. A mass annihilation of bison began south of the border. Meanwhile, the Dominion government was committed to building a railroad from coast to coast to bring British Columbia into Confederation. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald needed Rupert's Land to complete the transcontinental railway running through Regina, Moose Jaw, and Swift Current in southern Saskatchewan. This is a photo of Swift Current train station in 1885. Sir John A. wanted the railroad near the United States border so that settlements would discourage Americans from attempting to claim Canadian territory. The government feared that conflicts with Indigenous people could disrupt the advancement in the West. In 1870, Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land for £300,000 to the Dominion of Canada. The company's land covered the edge of the Rocky Mountains to the Great Lakes and was divided into the province of Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. The Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories were sold were not included in the land transfer negotiations. After learning of the transaction, the Indigenous people demanded recognition and compensation. Numbered treaties were signed between 1871 and 1877 in specific regions and according to specific social conditions to support the Dominion's short-term agenda for development. To Canada, they were a legal necessity in anticipation of settlement. For Plains communities, treaties were a means to secure their well-being in the face of an uncertain future. First Nations demanded recognition of their ownership of the land. They sought renewal of the social safety net they had grown accustomed to during the fur trade, and assistance in the conversion to agriculture. By 1874, the bison herds were seriously declining. Generally, the Indigenous people knew that change was inevitable because their natural food resource was disappearing and settlers were arriving. They believed that treaty negotiations would provide protection and resources. Saskatchewan First Nations wanted a treaty like the one signed in Manitoba. They wanted to ensure that they would have land, retain the right to hunt, fish, and trap, and be assisted in their transition to farming so that they could take their place and support their families in the coming agrarian society. Treaty 4, signed in September of 1874, was negotiated in a region much of which later became the southern half of Saskatchewan. Hunger was the driving force behind chiefs' decision to sign the treaty. 13 principal bands signed on to Treaty 4. Later, other bands signed adhesions to the treaty and were awarded reserve land. Treaty 4 is the first of the numbered treaties in which First Nations adhered to the treaty after it had been determined and signed. Therefore, they had to accept the terms as they were written. Chief Pasqua articulated the frustration of the Indians succinctly. Pointing to Hudson Bay Company's MacDonald, the chief was reported to have said, "You told me that you had sold the money for so much money. We want that money." The pipe ceremony, which symbolized mutual respect, was not performed at the Qu'Appelle meeting. Treaty medals, as shown, were made as presentation gifts to chiefs. Terms of the treaty included Indian rights to hunting, trapping, and fishing, with the federal government providing ammunition and other supplies. Each family received farm tools, a gift of clothing, and $5 annually. Family groups received a plow and harrows. Chiefs received a yoke of oxen, a bull, and 4 cows, a chest of carpenter's tools, $25 per year, and a suit of clothing every 3 years. Each band of the 13 was awarded one section or 640 acres of land for each family of 5. This determined the size of each reserve. Provision for education was also made. Treaty 4 is the only treaty for which there is a First Nations interpretation of the terms of the treaty. This document is in the process of being interpreted, but you can see in the photo some items like clothing and a plow that were mentioned in the government document. Treaty 6, signed between 1876 and 1882, was also agreed to because people were starving. These First Nations signatories added a medicine chest and a promise for assistance from pestilence. The food shortage continued as bison herds declined. This contributed to a measles outbreak among the Saulteaux. In 1877, 3,600 treaty people moved from their reserve land to the Cypress Hills, where the remnants of the bison population were living. In 1878, the bison population collapsed, leading to region-wide famine and the emergence of tuberculosis, which was rare in the pre-treaty period. Métis and First Nations collected and sold buffalo bones that were scattered across the prairie in order to stave off starvation. They sold them to stores in Swift Current, who sold and shipped them to factories in the east. In 1880, there was a riot at Fort Walsh because of food shortages. In the same year, a Dr. Haggerty, who provided vaccination for measles, scarlet fever, and smallpox, was terminated. In 1880-1881, Chief Piapot, seen in the photo, and Chiefs Big Bear and Little Pine wanted a concentration of reserves at Cypress Hills with partial autonomy. But in 1882, the Prime Minister announced that all Indians in the territory of Assiniboia would be removed by force if necessary from the land south of the proposed railway. 5,000 people were expelled from the Cypress Hills. In 1881, it was announced that no barter, trade, or exchange of goods was allowed from reserves. This was supposedly to preserve food for those who grew it, but it meant that Indigenous people were barred from participating in the new agrarian society. From 1882 to 1885, food was stockpiled but not handed out to starving people. By 1884, the Department of Indian Affairs were no longer saviors but agents of their subjugation. Edgar Dewdney, seen in the photo, served as Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories from 1879 to 1888 and was a harsh overseer of Indigenous people. From 1881 to 1883, when buffalo herds were seen to be headed towards Fort Walsh, Dewdney ordered that food rations for Fort Walsh be reduced. Criticized for not responding to 4 official requests for food aid during the winter of 1882-83, for over 2,000 Indians here almost naked and on the verge of starvation, Dewdney stated that it was government policy to use famine to force Indians on reserves. As a member of Parliament for Assiniboia from 1888 to 1891, Dewdney was also Minister of the Interior and Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Although he had made some headway with Blackfoot, providing them with people who would train them to use farm implements, he was quoted as saying, "The longer they continue to act against the wishes of the government, the more wretched will they become." Here you can see a meeting between Dewdney and Chief Piapot. Dewdney, associated with I.G. Baker and Company of Montana, profited by getting Canadian contracts for them. I.G. Baker often sent poor quality meat, including rancid meat that killed some people. The 1885 resistance was a Métis action due to frustration that the federal government did not address their many petitions regarding their lack of formal title to lands and their desire for proper political representations. Most of the First Nations involved were coerced into participating, but they received harsh punishment. After the 1885 resistance at Batoche, 8 warriors were sent to the gallows. Dewdney wanted the hangings to be a spectacle, even though public executions had been banned in 1868. They arranged for First Nation families to come and watch. Sir John A. Macdonald said to Dewdney, "The executions ought to convince the red man that the white man governs." Agents often use their power negatively. One told Dewdney that they were not getting enough flour, but I like to punish them a little. In 1879, Nicholas Davin was sent by Sir John A. Macdonald to research Indian boarding schools in the United States. Davin found that they were a very effective means of deconstructing young Indians. This photo is a before and after image of a child sent to residential school. The first residential schools in Saskatchewan were opened in 1883 at Battleford and LeBret. The rest, 20 more, were opened after the 1885 resistance. The last to be opened was Prince Albert Indian Residential School, a Church of England school, in 1951. And the last residential school to close was in Punachai in 1996. This means that 4 generations of people were separated from family and indoctrinated with a culture that was not there. This in itself is appalling before you even approach the abuse that so many suffered. Overcrowded, disease-ridden accommodations and physical and sexual abuse scarred residents in ways that can still be seen today. Major Walsh of Fort Walsh, the Cypress Hills outpost of the Northwest Mounted Police, was moved by the fate of those who endured the famine. He said, "The conduct of those starving and destitute people, their patient endurance, their sympathy, and the extent to which they assisted each other, their strict observance of law and order, would reflect upon the most civilized society." This is the Treaty 4 flag. The late Gordon Oakes had a dream, and in that dream came this symbol. The flag has 4 sections that represent not only the treaty aspect, but also represents many aspects of community, life, and our roles. This has been adopted as an icon in Treaty 4 territory for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It also reflects the duration of the treaty, which is, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. We live in Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux bands of the Ojibwe people, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.